I'd like to begin by first applauding the previous panel on Egypt. For those people who were here, that was an incredibly rich, substantive, and nuanced discussion of contemporary Egyptian politics. And I'm very much hoping, and in fact I'm certain, that we can match the caliber of that conversation with the panel that we've put together today, examining the relationship between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and their mutual rivalry and its consequences for the politics of the Middle East. We've put together what I consider to be an incredibly high-quality panel. I've known all of the three speakers actually for many years. I've read many of their writings. I often strongly agree with them, and sometimes I often strongly disagree with what they have to say. And so the nature of those agreements and disagreements, I suspect, might come up during the course of this conversation. The format for this event is going to be that of a public conversation. I have some introductory remarks I want to make on the question of the Iran-Saudi rivalry and where the United States fits into this picture. I'm going to pose some questions, and then we're going to leave some time at the end of it all for audience participation and interventions. The standard narrative that we hear in the United States about the nature of the rivalry between the Islamic Republic of Iran and Saudi Arabia is that it is fundamentally based on ancient sectarian differences. This conflict, we are told, is rooted in a primordial and seemingly intractable hatred between the two dominant sects of Islam that go back to the 7th century. So to quote from one prominent commentator and analyst of U.S. foreign policy, Thomas Friedman, a few years ago he wrote that the conflict in Yemen today is really in its essence a war between the two main sects of Islam over a 7th century struggle with respect to the succession of the Prophet Muhammad. That's what's going on in Yemen today. More recently, in a very important and insightful piece that Dexter Filkins wrote in The New Yorker, where he talked about the Iran-Saudi rivalry. He provided a variation of that thesis, where he said that the Saudi-Iran rivalry actually, quote, dates back to the time of the Safavid Empire, which swept out of Persia in the 1500s and ruled much of the Arab world for 2 centuries. And actually, what's so disturbing about this narrative is that even within the region, increasingly constituents in groups of Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims buy into this idea that what's happening today really has deep historical, religious, and theological roots. Now, in a book that I recently co-edited with my colleague Danny Postel, we provide a counter-narrative to this ancient sectarian hatred argument. And we write in the introduction to our book that notwithstanding the rhetoric that we hear from Sunni monarchies, Iranian clerics, and some presidents for life in the various Arab republics, most of the ruling elites in the Arab Islamic world are not politically wedded to a specific sectarian identity, even if their social support base is. It is not theological doctrines or loyalty to the collective interest of a religious sect that drives the politics of sectarianism in the region today. The core allegiance for ruling elites is to their political thrones and their various clients, whether Sunni or Shia, who can help sustain their power. In other words, the root and the nature of the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran today is really about power and not piety. So the question that I want to sort of pose to the panel as an introductory subject, because the title of this panel is Politics, Not Piety, Interpreting the Nature of the Saudi-Iran Rivalry, is that in my reading of this conflict, this is fundamentally about realpolitik calculations. The realist school of international relations perfectly explains what's going on today. This is a battle between 2 authoritarian regimes who have very horrific internal human rights records and are pursuing regional hegemony, in many ways advancing their interests in what they seem to think is a zero-sum calculation of geopolitical rivalry. So that's my assessment and my reading of the nature of the conflict. So my first question to the panel is, what's missing from that interpretation? Do you agree that this is fundamentally what's going on? What would you add to this narrative in terms of what's driving the conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia that is so destabilizing the region in so many spheres of conflict? Let's start with Hussein, and then we'll go down the line.
I largely agree with it. I certainly agree with it more than the received wisdom, which you've deconstructed very well. It's a silly myth, and it's so much easier to think of things as innate, immutable, historic, rather than get into what they really are. What's missing is a phrase which is national interest. This is a battle of national interests. And the other word that I don't think showed up in your summary was politics or political, and it's entirely political, right? Rather than so it's strategic and political rather than religious and sectarian is how I would look at it. And there's many different ways of bursting the bubble of the myth. You can just look at the history of, say, Saudi-Iranian relations in the 20th century and see how the relations waxed and waned and ebbed and flowed and what have you. If this were immutable, age-old, etc., there wouldn't have been these periods of rapprochement. They wouldn't have ended up on the same side in the Cold War, more or less, etc. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't problems that persist anyway, problems regarding territorial disputes between the Arab states and Iran, for example, or other disputes. But essentially, it is, I think, without doubt, a question of national interest, and I agree with you. It's mostly about power and regional hegemony. I don't think either Iran or Saudi Arabia really threatens the internal security and stability of either state. So it's about regional power projection, and I think it's fair to say that from the Saudi point of view, the accumulation of Iranian influence, the expansion of Iranian influence, since 2003, since the fall of Saddam Hussein, has been exceptionally alarming, and almost to an existential point of view. And I can explain why they think that, but that's what they think. I think Iran has its own narrative about terrorism, about Wahhabism, it's all the stuff you get from Mr. Zarif's New York Times articles, and he lays it out pretty well there. There's the two narratives that are that set this up. The other thing, though, it should be said, there is a sectarian component in two ways. Number one, there is a struggle for authority within the Islamic world. Saudi Arabia asserts authority based on history and geography, the custodianship of the holy mosques, and claiming to be more Islamic than anybody else because of its system and purer and whatnot. I think there's a similar claim, or an analogous claim, from the regime of the Islamic Republic, which claims to be the vanguard of the uprising of the Mustadafan and everybody else in the name of Islam, and the leader of the world's Muslims from a kind of a revolutionary and Islamist point of view. And these are competing claims of authority. So it's, yes, it's an ideological patina on top of the struggle for power, but it is there. And partly because of that, and for other reasons that I'm sure we'll get into, the region is dividing, not entirely, but to a large extent along sectarian lines. People are choosing up sides, and until they feel secure, people are tending to side with, Sunni powers are tending to side with Saudi Arabia and its allies. Shiite and other non-Sunni Muslims tending to side with Iran. This is very complicated, but even that doesn't explain much, because look at what's happening in Iraq right now with Muqtada Sadr, with the Prime Minister Abadi, with Grand Ayatollah Sistani, and so obviously it's not as simple as that.
Right. Great. Trita?
Thank you. Thank you first for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here. I find myself in violent agreement with most of what has been said. And I think you phrase it well by asking what is missing. Clearly there are certain aspects missing, and if I were to add something that I think Hussein did not touch upon, although he went briefly into it in 2003, this is not just a struggle of power. That is one very important aspect of it, but you also have to understand the context. It is happening in a region that since 2003 does not have an established balance of power. After 2003, between 1991 and 2003, or actually 1994 and 2003, the order in the region was essentially based on America providing security for the region through the dual containment policy, the policy of isolating Iran and Iraq at the same time, centered on the security of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Egypt primarily. The Iranians hated this order. They did everything they could to defeat it because it was essentially putting them in a prolonged state of isolation. But it wasn't they who destroyed that order. It was George W. Bush. By going into Iraq, thinking he was going to be able to establish a new order, all he managed to do was to destroy the existing order. And in the process, weakening the United States to the point in which the US no longer had the capacity to enforce on the region a new equilibrium. And particularly since 2005, I would say, the region has been orderless. There's no hegemon, there is no combination of states that have the capacity of establishing that type of hegemony. And this then unleashes the rivalries that always are there, sectarianism, ideology, all of those things come and go, but the rivalry between great powers will always easily be unleashed in a scenario in which there is no established balance. And I can sympathize with the Saudi perspective, because I think from their perspective, they believe they lived up to their end of the bargain with the United States. They did the things that was asked of them, keeping oil prices relatively stable, not making too much of a fuss about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and in return they wanted the protection and the security umbrella of the United States. But then the US goes into Iraq against the advice of the Saudis, and what the Saudis had predicted pretty much ended up happening, with Iran being unleashed, expanding its influence. Now, from the Iranian perspective, I think it's also important to understand that the dual containment era was an unnormal era. In the history of the region for the last 3,000 or so years, it's not been particularly common that Iran would be an isolated state or that the entire order in the region would be based on its exclusion. So in their perspective, that order was not indigenous. It could not stand on its own leg. It could only stand on the leg if the US was paying for it through its blood and treasure. And now there's an opportunity to move towards some sort of a balance in the region that actually would have an indigenous ability to sustain itself. Now, in the absence of diplomacy, in the absence of the parties being able to talk to each other and actually establish rules of engagement, you will see exactly what we're seeing right now. An orderless region in which both sides are pretty much at it, and from the Saudi side in particular in Israel, there's a strong desire to see the United States come back into the region militarily, re-establish its hegemony, and turn the clock back and re-establish the pre-2003 balance of power. There was a failure to do so from the Saudi side of convincing the US to go in that direction under Obama, because America's perspective, at least under Obama, was that the region had lost strategic significance. It was not that strategically valuable for the United States to be that involved and certainly pay the cost of taking the clock back. And instead the US wanted to pivot to Asia, where the real challenges to the US's global standing will come in this period, in this century. But I think understanding that this is not a rivalry that just came out of nowhere. It came out of the fact that the established balance was gone, and we're now in the process of trying to find a new equilibrium. And that can be done through two ways. It can be done on the battlefield, or it can be done through diplomacy. And unfortunately, right now, there is a huge diplomacy deficit in the region.
Great, thanks. What would you add to this conversation about trying to explain the nature of the rivalry between these two regional powers?
Well, I'm glad we all agree on rejecting sort of the primordialist, essentialist theories. However, I will also criticize this consensus on realist approaches where we kind of valorize the state as a unitary rational actor in the region pursuing its interest, and a balance of power can explain this. It sort of takes me back to my grad IR seminar with one of my old professors, Stephen Walt, who very much had this kind of approach or take on politics in the region. And my criticism of his approach was that it doesn't take into account, one, the fact that much of politics in the region isn't propelled by this unitary state actor model, but rather by regimes. And the regime and the state may not be the same thing. According to sort of the neo-realist theories, a country like Saudi Arabia would seek to maximize its state capacity, military power, and project it. Some of that is happening, but it's a very recent development. Prior to that, they very much preferred to keep their military weak, and the massive expenditures on arms, and there's a division between the National Guard and the Army and so on, and the massive expenditures in arms are in a way payoffs, security payoffs for the real protection which was to be afforded by the United States or Great Britain. So I think we need to make that distinction between the regimes and this notion of the state. So I would accept that it's very much regime survival for these regimes. Now what's interesting is that we accept that identity is socially constructed, but that doesn't make it less real. And what happens is that you see, interestingly, if you look at some of the earlier writings on this topic we're talking about, going back to Malcolm Kerr and the Arab Cold War, or Leonard Binder, who had this really seminal piece, which is not really referenced much, but it should be, which is the Middle East as a subordinate international system. He approaches the region, the post-Ottoman, post-Sykes-Picot region from this notion of international systems theory. And really, what's interesting here is if you look at countries like Turkey and Iran, when they had, as part of this, whether it was Ataturk or Reza Shah, very much a modernizing, secularizing project, very committed to sort of divorcing itself from its Islamic past. They fit into this scheme where they were on the periphery, and the sort of Arab core is where this Arab Cold War took place. Israel also played an important role, going back to Ben Gurion's strategy of periphery, which is referring exactly to that model, looking at Turkey and Iran as allies. What was interesting is, with the process of democratization in Turkey, you had sort of the renewal, sort of much deeper Seljuk and Ottoman Islamic identity and heritage of the country. So Turkey went from being this external player, which was not seen as a threat by a country like Saudi Arabia or by Israel, for example, but now Turkey sees itself connected to Aleppo, to Jerusalem, and so on. So then it becomes a threat. And I would argue the same thing happened with Iran in the '79 revolution. It's not that, it's when identities overlap in a way that you can interfere in the politics of one's neighbors and make claims that transcend borders, but you have regimes that are not democratic. And so all such it's seen in a way as transgressive, all this kind of diffusion, and as a threat. And that explains then the counter-revolution against the Arab Spring as well, where you had Turkey and Qatar, who were supportive of these democratic changes and reform, and you had an alliance that emerged very quickly, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, to launch a counter-revolution against this. And then you have, of course, external actors. And I'll just, my last point would be, it's very interesting how, when you had the coup in Egypt, the motley assortment of players that immediately came to congratulate General Csid. This included congratulatory telegrams from Vladimir Putin, Bashar al-Assad, Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, the Saudi UAE royal families, King Abdullah of Jordan as well. People, all from who were on very bitter terms, they could all agree on suppressing the Arab Spring. So.
Well, you know, now we move to more immediate and pressing concerns. The International Crisis Group, at the beginning of this year, 2018, identified the Saudi-Iran conflict as second on its list of global conflicts to watch in the coming year. In fact, they actually describe the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran as the U.S.-Saudi-Iran rivalry to watch as a potential conflict. And as we all know, in this city, John Bolton and Mike Pompeo are coming into office. Recently, the Saudi Crown Prince, MBS, was in the United States, where he received a heroic welcome. And one of the interesting themes that he kept hitting in his public commentary and discussion was the nature of the Iranian threat that's posed not just to the region, but to the world. In fact, he repeatedly analogized the Islamic Republic of Iran to Nazi Germany. In fact, he actually said it's much worse than Nazi Germany. So with the impending decision next month that Donald Trump will pull out of the Iran nuclear accord, and with this convergence of these political actors in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel, and then of course with their close alliance here in the White House, it seems like we're headed toward a potential war with Iran, particularly in the aftermath of the Trump withdrawal from the Iran nuclear agreement, and then the perceived Iranian reaction, well, they will then restart their enrichment program, thus setting the course for a war that seems inevitable based on where we are today. So the question is, are there any options available that can actually stop the slide to war? I mean, just yesterday, Emmanuel Macron said that in his conversations with Donald Trump, he's sort of given up. He's been unsuccessful to convince Donald Trump to stay in the Iran nuclear agreement, despite his best arguments and protestations that this is in the best interests of international security. So it looks like we're headed to war. I'd be very surprised if a year from now we are not in some serious confrontation with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and sort of Israel sort of leading the way with strong support from Washington, D.C. Is there anything, so the question is there anything that can really stop this constellation of forces that have sort of aligned themselves and that seem to be promoting a confrontation with Iran, which would obviously have catastrophic consequences for regime stability? Is there anything that could stop this movement toward war?
I've got to say, I read reality very differently than you do. And I, to the contrary, would be surprised if there is a war between Iran and any other party, major conflict, in the next 12 months. I'm not at all convinced that Donald Trump is going to completely scuttle the JCPOA. I understand what Macron was saying, and there seems to be a game of this bizarre, coy, will I, won't I thing, you know, tune in next week for the big finale. But I can't imagine going into this big project in Pyongyang to make a deal with Kim Jong-un and having just torn up an American agreement with, not just with Iran, but with the other 5 signatories, and it's all based on the United Nations. So, I mean, what we may just as easily be looking at, and I still think this is the case, is brinksmanship, designed to extract something from the E3 that will allow President Trump to say it was the worst deal ever, and I fixed it. And now I'm going to go and make the best deal ever with North Korea. You can easily see what that deal is going to be. That's a very easy one to do, as long as you don't actually want to solve the problem. You can, you know, get people to promise everything and declare everything great. And you know, if you're basically a confidence person, then no problem. I don't really see this as inevitable at all. To the contrary, I would say where there are 2 flashpoints that should be worrying, or 3 maybe. One is Syria, where there are at least 2 places in Syria where there is a danger. And it is certainly on the northern Israeli border in the occupied Golan Heights, where there's both Iranian and Iranian-backed forces, including Hezbollah, becoming much stronger and more entrenched, in addition to some Salafist jihadist groups, Daesh and others who are in that area as well. The Israelis are very, very nervous about this situation, and I certainly think you could see an Israeli-Hezbollah conflict either in Lebanon or even more likely in Syria itself, with the Israelis and possibly others trying to degrade Hezbollah's capabilities in Syria. You know, and maybe it would spread to Lebanon or not. There are reasons to want to contain it in Syria. Another place where there's a real potential for conflict is on the Iraqi-Syrian border, in this little area of Al-Qaim, Husayba, and Ramal, where you could make a land bridge, and then there's Tanf, which right now is in American hands, but you know, who knows. And any, I think, attempt to consolidate a secured military corridor from Iran to the Mediterranean through the Iraqi-Syrian border area, that could be an issue, certainly. And finally, there's the question of the Houthi missiles continuously falling on Saudi cities, which is a major, major irritant. And if that's not stopped in a way to calm things down in Yemen, stop those missiles, and then ultimately figure out a way of extracting the Arab Expeditionary Forces from Yemen and getting some kind of a deal, you might see a blow up there. But to me, all of those are containable without a major conflict. And honestly, I see the reasons for avoiding it as outweighing the reasons getting into it. I don't expect one. So there you go.
So Trita, do you share Hussein's optimism?
Oh, we finally have some disagreement. This conversation was getting a little bit boring.
It was bound to happen, right?
I do have some disagreement. I think those 3 flashpoints are interesting. I am not as convinced as to why they would be able to be containable when we have such an escalatory attitude in so many of the capitals, and certainly more so in Washington, with Pompeo and Bolton coming in. Bolton clearly has not hidden his desire for a military confrontation, and finally coming to the point in which he is the national security advisor to an extremely naive and unknowledgeable president is probably creating a temptation for him that I doubt that he can resist. But there are other things that I think is also important to keep in mind. Hussein mentioned the conventional wisdom that I agree with, but we just deal with an unconventional administration right now, so we have to set aside conventional wisdom at times. Clearly going to Pyongyang after having killed the Iran deal, in the minds of most people would be a no-no because it would undermine the US's credibility. But when you listen and you talk to people close to this administration, you see a different logic. And their logic is, by killing the Iran deal, Trump is showing that he is willing to walk away from any deal the North Koreans put forward unless it is the deal that Trump wants. And as a result, he's actually showing himself being tougher in these negotiations and signaling clearly to the North Koreans that if you want to deal with me, I need to get what I want. Otherwise, I'm not just willing to walk away from the table with you, I'm willing to kill an existing deal. Now, to most people, this would be not a particularly wise approach, but this administration seems to really excel when it comes to grandstanding and things like that. So if you take that into account, and this is the path, and this is the mindset that the administration is going to be approaching almost all of these other issues, the fear that comes into place is at one point, you essentially have to be lucky in every one of these exercises in order for this not to get out of control, because you don't have much de-escalatory control. And I don't know how many times we can be lucky in the absence of actual proper diplomacy being able to bring this back. The one factor perhaps that would cause the president not to go forward entirely is that at the end of the day, he is signaling very clearly and repeatedly that he's willing to go in this direction, even militarily, but only if Saudi Arabia pays for it. So it seems to be a bargaining with Saudi Arabia that is taking place publicly as well as to whether to go in this more militaristic direction or not.
Can I just add just quickly? Yeah, I mean, I really see the Trump administration a little differently than you. He likes to talk tough, but I think he was not elected to start another Middle East war. And he's taken a very strong stance against those that created various Middle Eastern wars. And I think his base would not appreciate it, and I will be very surprised if this guy, with his rhetoric, actually does this when it could be avoided. So I just want to say that.
Majid, how do you read this sort of slide to war? Where do you situate yourself between Hussein and Trita?
Well, I see this, the irony in what Hussein just mentioned is that Trump set himself apart from the Republican, other Republican contenders by lamenting the $7 trillion, he keeps talking about it, dollars that we've wasted in wars in the Middle East and so on. And so if that Donald Trump holds, then I think there's a break on escalation. But on the other hand, who did he hire? I mean, he hired the worst possible people, the most fanatical people, Pompeo, Bolton, when it came to promoting, and they've on record as calling for, they don't advocate a boots on the ground invasion, but they advocate a massive aerial bombing campaign against Iran's industrial and defense infrastructure, and foolishly thinking that it will just end there and then they can walk away from.
But we just saw what happened with these people in the mix in Syria, and it was the fireworks display at Bashar's victory celebration. It sent a very clear message. Russian deterrence works, Iranian deterrence works, and we don't want to do anything to destabilize al-Assad in most of Syria, in what he calls necessary Syria. It was the biggest affirmation of all of that you could have asked for, and these people the people you mentioned did not change that. And so be careful of what's an act. Donald Trump is an actor and a TV producer. And that's what he does.
That's a fair point.
But you finish your point, then Trita wants to jump in.
Sure, and that's a fair point. But it's Donald Trump's very shallowness and capriciousness that I think is the great uncertain, fearful element here.
That's true.
And given that, I think there are clearly elements in the administration, people like Bannon and others who were propelling this kind of civilizational clash. They were tied into Israel's the Hood bloc. And certainly supported and shit on by the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And the reason was that, and Bannon said openly that North Korea has nuclear weapons, we've gained it, we can't have a conflict with them. Iran, of course, doesn't. And so, and it's the very fact that Iran doesn't, which makes it more likely, perhaps, as a target. But I think the one thing you mentioned was that I think the real, I think the real factor here that's determinative would be what China and Russia seek to do. And originally, the reason a lot of what was going on in the Seychelles and so on had to do with buying Russia off, making a deal with Russia regarding Ukraine as a way of Russia giving up on Iran and not backing Iran. That was clearly really what was motivating a lot of the UAE and Eric Prince and all of these other people, and Bannon as well. But that seems to have fallen through. And Trump has, of course, is taking a belligerent attitude towards China and Russia at the same time, which someone like Henry Kissinger, I think, would never have done. And so then the question arises, how much room will there be for the U.S. to maneuver if those two powers decide to create a balance of breakers?
Okay, great. Trina, you wanted to add something?
So Hussein said something very interesting. He said, you know, Trump is an actor. And I think we would all agree with that. And then the question arises, when is he acting and when is he not acting? I think people will perhaps tend to read in whatever they want to read in. So when he goes out there and he says, we should bring our troops back, $7 trillion, all of this intervention, what did it do? Is he acting or is he himself? I think a lot of people would tend to think that he's himself, and as a result that this is his true inner self, this is his instinct. Well, then pay attention to the sentence he said right after that. He said, well, I know a lot of people are very interested in our decision, whether to go into Syria or not. I know the Saudis are very interested. Well, if they want us to do it, then perhaps they should pay for it. Okay, hold on. Are you saying you don't want to be in the Middle East and Syria because it's against the U.S. national interest and you believe that $7 trillion have been wasted? And as a result, it lies in your interest to pull out? Or are you saying that, hey, it's really not that good, but if you're willing to pay for it, I'm willing to do it? I don't think he has any principle. I don't think he understands what national interest is. Because whether you stay or leave should be completely driven as of an analysis of whether it is in the U.S. interest to do so or not whether the Saudis are willing to sign a check or not.
Well,
Same last comment to you, and then we're going to move
I
forward.
think it can be understood in terms of pandering politics, right? In the sense, what he just said with Macron was very remarkable. He basically conceded that the United States was not going to pull out of the 1/4 of Syria that's under American sway, even though he probably meant it when he said, I want to pull out. It's very consistent with what his base would want. So when he said, I want to do it, he really wanted to do it. Then he was confronted by the reality of what would happen, say, in the areas I was talking about on the border and things like that. Both in terms of Iran and its allies and whatever will replace Daesh, which is not gone but dispersed. Under such circumstances, he threw in two things. Number one, that others should pay. And number two, that they wouldn't last a week without the United States, and he gave these gratuitous insults to them. Essentially, there's something for the US allies in the Gulf and Israel and everyone else, we're staying. And something for the public. We will dismiss these countries and demand they pay and insult them, and then everyone's covered. It's a very, you're right, I mean, national interest should not be calculated like this, but that's what we got.
So getting back to the question of sectarianism, the sponsors of this conference are very much interested in the question of democracy in the Arab Islamic world. And of course, I think most reasonable people will realize that one of the preconditions for democratic advancement and enhancement would be to try and roll back or de-sectarianize the politics of the Middle East. Recently, the Iranian foreign minister was in New York, and he suggested one way of perhaps trying to reduce tensions between these two regional rivals is to think about a regional dialogue forum so that countries of the region can talk to each other, not about each other, and break away from the paradigm of exclusion, he said. Does that have any realistic possibility in the current atmosphere that we're living in? I mean, it sounds like a good idea if you believe in diplomacy. But what we're hearing, at least my reading, what we're hearing at least from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia and from his supporters here in Washington, D.C., is that they're not interested in dialogue or diplomacy, they're interested in war. So Hussein, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's what they're saying. I mean, they are, the first part, yes, they're not interested in that level of bilateral dialogue. They are saying that. I don't think they're saying they're interested in war, and I don't think they are interested in war. I think what they think is that the events in the region for the past 15 years have so disadvantaged them and so greatly strengthened the Iranian hand that they don't want to get into that kind of dialogue at this point. They want to deal with issues first. Like they need to, so from my point of view, a more realistic approach, as I keep writing, it would be a sequential one, where you begin with the resolvable issues like Yemen, I think, is, and maritime safety and security is another one, and then you move on to ones that are harder, like Syria and Iraq, and eventually you get to the really difficult ones, like the role of non-state actors, and where is Hezbollah going to operate, what's it going to do, and all that stuff. And well, once you're done with that, you resolve the issues entirely. And what you need, of course, in the end, is an understanding about spheres of influence, and that's really the nut that we're trying to crack. So right now, I don't think you can have that kind of dialogue, but you know, there are ways in which events can develop to set that up. And I think Saudi diplomacy in Iraq for the past couple of years, this is my most recent paper was on that. I think it's been very, very interesting. Riyadh's outreach to not just to Iraqis, but to Shia leaders in Iraq, including Ayatollah Sistani, including Muqtada Sadr, including Prime Minister al-Abadi, where they really have engaged with people who a few years ago, and some of them, not all of them, seemed to be very deeply entrenched in a regional pro-Iranian camp, and kind of made an implicit offer to them, which is not to say, look, you have to be pro-Riyadh, or you have to be anti-Iranian. No, that's not going to happen. But you know, to Iraqis, they're kind of implicitly saying, have some equidistance, reassert your own national interest, deal with Iran and with Saudi Arabia, get some independence, and that will work. In the end, you can imagine a similar kind of outreach in Syria, by the way, for Saudi Arabia as the dust settles. You can imagine something like that. If that kind of thing starts to pay off, and there's more of a, let's say, equilibrium in the region, and less of a sense, particularly with missiles falling on Saudi cities, that's certainly got to be taken care of. Then I think you can imagine getting to a place of dialogue, because they all know that the other side's not going to go away. They are not banking on regime change in each other's countries. This is unrealistic. And so there's going to be a modus vivendi. But one has to appreciate, I think, how badly the Saudis and others feel the past 15 years have gone in advantaging the other side in what they think is an unrealistic way.
Trita?
I think absolutely it is possible, and it's quite necessary in order to avoid an even worse disaster. I think there is a contradiction in the Saudi position, though. I don't know if they, accepted your proposition as saying, but
which one?
The second, to make it sequential.
No.
Because at
that's
the end of the day,
that's me. That's not anybody.
But I mean, even that is still dialogue. I don't know
Sure.
if Zarif's proposition was to have like a grand bargain. I think the idea of a regional dialogue forum, the reason why the Iranians want it is because aid and diplomacy is necessary, but it's also because they want to get the final acceptance from the Saudis that Iran is a power in the region and you have to deal with it. And the era of just trying to exclude Iran is over. And I think that's precisely part of the reason why the Saudis are not particularly interested at this point. And I understand it, as you said, for the last 15 years, almost every geopolitical trend has gone against their interests. They feel weak, they feel entrenched, they feel that the Iranians have been making a lot of gains, and they're not willing to go to the table until they've at least exhausted the option of seeing, is America willing to do something to change this dynamic before they go to the table?
I think that's right.
And I fear that is, at the end of the day, a very problematic position, because what the United States, particularly with this administration, would be doing is not going to be non-military. So the changes that could come around by the U.S. Stepping in is going to end up leading to some form of a military confrontation. And I don't think that's ultimately going to be to the benefit of the U.S., the Saudis, or anyone else in the region.
Yeah,
I think there's one other aspect I wanted to mention here that, we're talking, you mentioned the sectarian dimension, and there was talk about the identity dimension. I sense there is an issue on the Saudi side. I don't know exactly how to categorize it or classify it, but I've heard it from enough Saudi officials in private conversations. The argument that Iran needs to stop meddling in Arab affairs.
Mm-hmm.
I think if the statement had been Iran needs to stop meddling in the affairs of its neighbors, I think it would be absolutely correct statement. Not only should Iran stop doing so, Saudi Arabia should stop doing so, no more kidnapping of prime ministers, etc. But when you add the word Arab affairs, it gives the impression that there is this idea that there is an Arab world and then there is the non-Arab world. And Iran, because of its non-Arab makeup, essentially is an illegitimate player and does not have any legitimate influence or interest or spheres of influence, as you talked about, in its immediate neighborhood that is Arab by virtue of not being Arab. So despite its very long history of relations with Lebanon, for instance, it would never actually have any legitimate interest there compared to, I don't know, Morocco or some other country that I assume has not had the same type of a depth of relationship, simply because it's not Arab. Now, Iran can change its policies. Iran cannot change its ethnicity. And when that mindset is put forward, that, you know, it's because Iran is not Arab, I think it creates a scenario in which it's going to be very difficult to find peaceful solutions. And I think there's you can imagine if Europe had pursued that same mentality. There was a Germanic part of Europe and then there's a Latin part of Europe and stuff. This is a recipe for absolute disaster. So that mindset, that line of thinking, I think needs to be changed. And in my conversations with Saudi officials, I found it very fascinating. When I raise this issue, it's been interesting that their reaction is oftentimes, well, that's not what we meant, and not really thinking about it in those terms, or not recognizing how that's likely going to be perceived by any non-Arab country in the region.
It's heard differently by Arabs and non-Arabs.
Mujib, last comment to you, because I want to give the audience a chance to weigh in, and time is fleeting.
Yeah, so, you know, the only antidote to this the politics of internecine conflict and divide and rule is democratic politics, emergence of civil societies. And so until we see that, I'm afraid we're going to continue and double down on these on this type of policies. And so I'm completely unconvinced this notion that MBS is a reformer and, you know, Wahhabism is going to be kind of maybe gentle and kind and tolerant and so on. I don't see, maybe for purposes of entertainment at home and things like that, but I don't see that changing at all in terms of the policy. Though I would say that Iran also really fell into this trap. I don't think Iran started the sectarian trap. It's very much a Salafi, Wahhabi, going back even with Zarqawi and so on, and well before that in Pakistan, and this was going on in the 1980s. But in Syria, they fell into that trap, supporting this brutal genocidal dictator. So I think Iran really needs to step back from that and reconsider what it's doing there. And then going forward, but I would also, you know, one thing on this issue, people make this very simplistic, Sunni, Shia. So let's be clear. In much of the Sunni world and for Sunni middle classes, they don't look at the Saudi family, Al Saud family, or the Al Nahyan family in the UAE as representing Sunni Islam. They're well aware they funded the coup in Egypt, they funded the counter-revolutions against emerging Muslim middle classes and democratic movements. And so there's no love lost there. You clearly see that with Turkey's position regarding them as well. So the idea that somehow they represent or lead a Sunni bloc for most Sunnis around the world is farcical.
But you know, it can't be the case that that there can't be relative stability in the Middle East until all the countries are functional democracies. That really is putting the cart before the horse. I mean, in the long democratization across the world is going to take a long, long time, and I really think we need a calmer, more orderly international system. We can get it before we have full democratization all over the Middle East. We need it.
Fair point.
Yeah.
We've got about 10 minutes left, and we want to stick to the program schedule. So let's turn the floor over to the audience. I think there are microphones that I'm hoping that someone might have that they can pass around. I see Kamran's hand up, and I see another hand up there, and one at the back. So let's try and take those three questions. Does anyone know where the microphone is, so that everyone...
He's got it.
Could someone grab that microphone and maybe pass it over to Kamran? Thank you very much. This is one of our speakers this afternoon. He's not entrusted with this task, but we appreciate him lending his support. Kamran, go ahead.
That's all.
Thank you for a very enlightening and rich discussion on what I call geosectarianism, geopolitical sectarianism. So this is a question to everybody. And so, Trida, you said that the Saudis would want to be able to improve their leverage before they come to the bargaining table. And for that, they need U.S. assistance. That shifts the entire conversation from a purely political analysis to one that is military. Military analysis, I mean, I see this all the time in this town, is taken for granted, and it's a very different animal than political analysis. What will it take for the United States to help the Saudis to alter that balance right now, or the upper hand, the net upper hand that Iran has? I don't think that the United States is interested in going that far. And we're forgetting the role of Turkey. So Turkey is a player in this region as well. And I read the Trump administration as well as the Obama administration saying, we're not taking the lead on fixing anything in this region. Let the regional players deal with it, and you know what, we'll come in where we will. So if you can address those points, please.
Trina, go ahead.
Excellent question. Thank you, Kamran. I think there is, in their line of thinking, a non-military option, which is what they're aiming for, which is A, kill the nuclear deal, reinstate sanctions, ideally get a UN Security Council resolution, Chapter 7, over the Houthi missiles, and we've seen that the Brits have put forward that resolution, and there's been attempts. We're seeing the early stages of this. That's the way it starts, and it's going to take a while before it's going to have some teeth. But you see that effort already being made. And then by containing and isolating Iran, again, the way it was before, but this time with even stricter sanctions, the belief is, the calculation is that this will help roll back so much of Iran's influence. It will break their economy. The same calculation that existed in 2010, 2011. The difference there, though, is that the president discovered, essentially by January 2013, that the sanctions clock and the amount of pressure the US was putting on the Iranian economy, which was very, very significant and had far more international buy-in than I think Trump can achieve. But nevertheless, that still did not move as fast as the advancement of the Iranian nuclear program. And that unless the president went back to the table in these secret negotiations in Oman, and if we just continued on the current path, it was far more likely that the United States would end up having to choose between accepting Iran as a nuclear power or going to war. Because the idea of actually completely crippling the Iranian economy increasingly was not in the cards. I think this administration, its allies in the region, have a different analysis, and they believe that if they can just massively put that economic pressure on Iran, they can still roll back, change the balance of power without going to war. The question then is, well, is Iran just going to sit there idly by when this is imposed? Are they going to go and continue to implement the JCPOA while all the sanctions are reimposed? I find that extremely unlikely. And as a result, the dynamic of the Iranians restarting the program, probably going above, or at least to 20%. They've even made threats about leaving the NPT, which I think would be extremely unwise. But nevertheless, this idea of we can reconstitute that pressure and roll back Iran through sanctions kind of assumes that the Iranians don't do anything in response, and I find that very unlikely.
That's one scenario, with the caveat that I think that they don't want the JCPOA actually to be, formally, they don't want the United States to be seen as the one destroying the JCPOA, so tweak that a little bit. The rest of it is definitely one scenario. There are other scenarios as well that are non-military, or at least, let's say, where the military steps are very limited and very focused and not in Iran at all. But I think other than that, you're right. There's some. This is the kind of thinking about how you could roll Iran back. And the key thing here now is to ensure, and this is not settled yet, that the outcome in Syria is, if not the beginning of rolling back Iran's influence in Syria, at least bookends it. Like, at least that it is the limitation of the extension of Iran's influence. And there, the border area is all important, and there I think you could see a whole other set of scenarios.
Let's get to the final two questions and see if we can wrap it up. Yeah, Kamran, if you can pass the microphone, I appreciate you sort of making the effort. And then there was one question at the back, and then we're going to try and end it. Maybe if we have time, we'll get to Jamal as well. Go ahead.
Yes. My first question is to Hussein. We always hear politicians and mass media talking about Iran meddling in the affairs of the Arab world. Yet we have never seen really any proof or any case that is vulgar and obvious.
Syria?
Could you tell us a little bit about it? And second is to Mr. Parsi.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Regarding how strong is the, or how bad the relationship really between Iran and Israel? And what would it take to untangle this once and for all?
I think the second question is actually
Yeah,
the more
the first
substantive
one has a
one.
one-word
Yeah,
answer.
yeah. So
Syria.
do you guys want to tackle the second question, and then we'll move on? If you can pass the microphone to the back, we'll go. Yeah, go ahead. Take that question about Israel and Iran.
So when it comes to Israel and Iran, I wrote a book about an era where they had secret relations. I don't think there's any secret relations going on right now. So what you're seeing is essentially what you're getting. It is in a very, very dangerous phase, as Hussein also pointed out earlier on. But even, I mean, one of the things that I think gives me a little bit comfort, not to say that I'm happy about the state of that relationship, is that both sides have not shown the degree of recklessness that we have seen elsewhere in the region. They are testing each other. It seems like what's going on in Syria, worst case, can lead to something much bigger and even worse for the Syrian people, but it could also be that they're right now trying to establish a new rule of engagement between the two of them. Because they've had a functioning one in Lebanon for quite some time, it's only been broken on a few occasions. Now the lines have changed because, and there's a need for one in Syria. Of course, the Israeli desire is to make sure that there's no Iranian presence there. I think that's probably quite unlikely. But at least if there is a presence, there needs to be clear rules of what can and cannot be done. And right now there seems to be, in an optimistic interpretation, an effort to establish that first militarily before there's any secret channels and communications. And I know a few states that in the past have played a role of helping establish that code of engagement.
Yeah, I completely agree with that.
We've got 2 minutes left. I want to get to the last question and then get the panel to sort of respond and use that opportunity also for closing remarks as well. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for this discussion. So you talked a lot about the Gulf crisis, the Iranian-Saudi rivalry, but my question is about the impact of that on politics in North Africa. We know that Morocco has traditionally strong ties with the Saudi royal family. We know that the Algerian rivals, they have traditional ties with Iran. But most importantly, what will be the impact on Tunisia, the democratic transition in Tunisia, and the local politics in Libya with the rebuilding of the state, especially with the last visit of President Macron. Maybe will we see a withdrawal of the US and replacement with the France? Thank you.
Okay, but we have 1 minute left. So the impact of the Iran-Saudi rivalry on North African politics. Okay, go ahead.
No,
please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's limited, and I think there's a bigger impact on the on North Africa of the internal rivalry, in particular between Abu Dhabi and Doha, where there's really neither are playing a particularly helpful role in, especially in Tunisia and Libya. There's more of a case to be made, but I would say. Everybody ought to be supporting the Tunisian experiment in democracy.
Treaty?
I would agree with Hussein when he says that I mean, luckily for you all, it is limited. But I think it also requires actions in the sense of actively trying to stay out and not end up becoming pawns in this rivalry that would be very destructive for everyone.
I think that's a good point.
Well, it's interesting. Let's see what happens in Libya. I think that is crucial, especially with General Haftar being incapacitated. What that does to the UAE Egyptian, Russian, French, and Italian efforts to kind of have a junior General Cid in power.
They're not going to give up on opposing Islamists because Haftar had a stroke. I can assure you of that. Neither should they.
They consider it, but they consider anyone who advocates often some kind of democratic Muslim politics as Islamist.
Well, there, I think there's a real critique to be made about what's the out. You know, what's your? There's a real gap in the argument there, which is the point I keep making, which is there has to be an alternative. And in this scenario, let's put it this way: in the argument over Islamism, I generally agree with the Emirati diagnosis, but there's a problem with the prescription because it needs to embrace the Tunisian model as an alternative that is viable and legitimate.
But wasn't the UAE was the leading power, in fact, to try to derail Nahda?
Well, that's why I'm saying it's a critique.
So you're criticizing?
Yes,
okay.
I'm saying it is where I think their model is solid until you get to that stage, and that's, I think, a problem with it. Yeah.
Okay, so on that note, let me thank the panelists for being here with us today, for providing us with very insightful and thoughtful commentary on this very particular thorny problem that unfortunately is not going away anytime soon. We've ended roughly on time in terms of the program, and we're going to shift now to, I think, a brief break, right, before we begin our lunchtime event. We'll go directly to lunch right now. Is lunch in this room, or is it somewhere else? It's next door. Okay, so on that note, please join me in thanking the panel for
Csid. Yes.
Thank you very much, Nader. Okay, thank you very much, Nader, Hussein, and everybody for your excellent panel. Now we're going to have lunch in the other room. So if you can please move to the next room on this side. We're going to have lunch and our keynote speaker and the panel on Turkey. And all of you are invited to attend lunch as our guests, even if you didn't pay for lunch. It's okay, we will pay for the lunch this time. So everyone is welcome to attend the next session,